Good morning. I'm Arlie Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for July 15th, 2021. Today we're going to take a look at the question of what does a systemic breakdown look like? We're going through a situation in which economies all over the world, in both the developing sector and the advanced sector, are going through cataclysmic changes, where we have strategic crises which are directly related to these economic crises. And all of this was predicted, was forecast back almost 50 years ago by Lyndon LaRouche on August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon made the mistake of severing the dollar from gold, that is to end the gold reserve system of the Bretton Woods system, and introduce a floating exchange rate system instead of the fixed exchange rate system that had been in place since the end of World War II up until then. And what LaRouche warned is that the neoliberal monetary policies that were associated with this would necessitate Schachtian austerity. Schachtian, named after Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's Minister of Finance, and that this would ultimately lead to a global breakdown. The obvious point is that if you take money and credit away from the physical economy for the sake of paying debt to keep the banks happy, what you do is undermine the most important aspect of an economy, which is physical goods production. And LaRouche said that's what was going to happen if this were allowed to stand. And it's not only been allowed to stand, but through a series of changes and transformations over the next 50 years, its magnitude has increased. The effect on the real economy has grown enormously, and we've gone through a whole series of speculative bubbles. LaRouche also proposed a solution back then: break with the British colonial policy, which was enforced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank on behalf of the central banks of the world, and instead go with a credit system, a system of national banking for each nation, where credit would be made available. And the IMF would serve the original purpose which it was tasked with, which is to make sure that the fixed exchange system works. If adjustments need to be made, you make them. But you don't make them by imposing austerity to shut down economies. Now, the looting that's occurred initially was looting by the advanced sector against the poorer countries of the world. Part of this was through the succession of free trade agreements, which made cheap labor available for global corporations so they could move their companies, their headquarters, their manufacturing to poorer countries, which created the mess we have today with supply chains. Secondly, deindustrialize the advanced sector in order to get cheaper labor costs in the already developed sector, ship all the industry to the poorer countries, and then use the floating exchange rates to set up a global casino based on speculation that was favorable to the likes of George Soros and his allies at the City of London. Now it's hitting the advanced sector. You have a breakdown in infrastructure, including in public health, with the insurance and pharmaceutical corporate cartels driving up the price of care and essentially restricting care for a growing sector of the population which can no longer afford either the insurance or the cost of medical care. There's been an increase in poverty, including in the advanced sector countries. A drop of many, many people in the United States who used to have good jobs in production into the lower middle class and below. So that it's almost 40% of the population could not come up with $400 in the case of an emergency. And now we have inflation hitting. The consumer price index, it was up 0.9% in June on a month-to-month basis, but 5.4% from last June to this June. And why was that happening? Well, because they're providing cheap credit. That is, the central banks are providing cheap credit to the corporate cartels, including the financial cartels primarily, in order to cover the debt which can't be paid. So they're creating more debt to pay the already unsustainable debt. And this is the result of a 50-year process of banking deregulation, of free trade agreements, and of an overall commitment to protect the too big to fail banks at the expense of the population. Now, what's happening in the poorer countries? Well, you look at Afghanistan, where years of war have created a situation where over half the population faces hunger problems. Millions of children have malnutrition, are food insecure. Afghanistan has become, over the years, not just now, the argument that it's just now a problem, over the years it's been a safe haven for terrorists and drug production, and that was created or expanded by the U.S. military and NATO presence in the country. Hopefully with that changing, with the U.S. and NATO leaving, maybe there can be a change based on other nations moving in to help. South Africa now is hit by rioting, more than 70 people killed. There's poverty. There's a raging pandemic there. There are blackouts, 43% unemployment in South Africa. Haiti, which just had the assassination of its president, suffers from endemic poverty, hunger, disease. And a country like Syria, which previously was relatively developed, now faces over half its population hungry because of the Caesar sanctions imposed by the vicious warlords of the US and Europe. So what's all of this mean? Well, either we're going to have more chaos and wars, or we're going to have a change. Now, yesterday at this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, there was a presentation by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and what he said is that the solution for Afghanistan is mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, consultation, respect for the diversity of civilizations, and pursuit of common development. And this is counter to what we've been doing, which goes back in the most recent form to the policy of Zbigniew Brzezinski and his co-thinker Samuel Huntington with their thesis of the clash of civilizations. This is a British imperial thesis that countries can't get along because of different cultures, different religions, different races. If it sounds familiar, it's identity politics that's being introduced in the United States. Now, what Wang Yi said is instead we need to cooperate to fight against terrorism, extremism, and separatism. And he said the key for this is investment in science, technology, and innovation. Well, that's what LaRouche said 50 years ago. And interestingly, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there was a call to the United States to join this fight, to work with particularly the nations of Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, the neighbors of Afghanistan, to carry out a program of mutual benefit and cooperation. And the key to that would be the extension of projects of the Belt and Road Initiative into Afghanistan. Now, as I said, what we're seeing instead from especially the British and the American side is more of a commitment to chaos and war. U.S. troops that are being moved out of Afghanistan are being prepared for deployment into the Indo-Pacific region, where the British are sending a carrier strike group to join with U.S. forces in the South China Sea. The target is Russia and China. Again, geopolitics. And typical of this was a speech given yesterday by the chief of MI5, the British Domestic Intelligence Agency, McCallum, who said, Russian and Chinese spies are everywhere. Every British citizen must keep an eye out for this. And he said they have a list of 10,000 attempts by spies who are attempting to manipulate British subjects. So what's the solution to this? More surveillance, spying on your neighbor. And what's the evidence for this? Well, he didn't present it because there is no evidence, just as there was no evidence of Russian collusion with Donald Trump to win the 2016 election. So you're left with a conclusion. Either we accept the idea of a Patriot Act, a super spy state, and the constant deployment for new wars. And with it, an economic collapse which will be used to consolidate a new global central bankers dictatorship called the Great Reset. Or we can end this imperial system the way LaRouche proposed in 1971. Those are the options. There are no other options. Now, each nation can have a different approach to how it's going to carry out a national development policy, a national banking system, infrastructure investment, and so on. The Chinese have one model, which is a pretty good model. The model that we have, the so-called Build Back Better world, is a hoax. It's a green financial bubble disguised as an infrastructure project. So the choices are clear. I'd ask you to join with us with the Schiller Institute to make sure we make the right choice this time that wasn't made in 1971 because of the fear of the oligarchy that LaRouche's policies would work and would be acceptable to most of the world's people. So thanks for joining me today. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll take your questions on this or anything else I've covered this week or anything else that interests you. Send your questions to me at harleysch@gmail.com.